Welcome back to Sports Wrap-Up. My guest in studio, Steve Tasker. Steve, great having you here, and very cash, enjoying the nice weather. You're coming off your busiest time of the year, I assume.
Yeah, it's this is kind of a nice time of year for me to get a little free time and relax a little bit. I stay about as busy as I want to stay, and it's good that way. It's a nice time of year for me, particularly when the weather's nice.
And we were just talking, and Steve is a very proud father because son Luke got signed by the San Diego Chargers as a free agent. He's there even as we speak.
Right. He left this last Thursday. He finished up all his obligations at Cornell. He's ready to graduate now, and he'll be in San Diego until graduation. He'll come back, and fortunately, there on that weekend is a good friend of ours, kind of part of my family, is getting married, him and his fiance. He'll come back for that and his graduation on that one weekend. He'll head back out, and he'll be in San Diego as long as he can hang in there. I was telling you off camera, he may be out there like me. I showed up here overnight in Buffalo, and I haven't left, so it's 27 years later. So it could happen to him out there.
Were you drafted?
Yes. Yeah, 226th overall.
By Houston?
Houston Oilers, yeah. Yeah.
Now, so, I mean, Luke, I know I saw him about a month or so ago. I saw him at DiPaolo's. I don't know if you've ever been there.
Yeah.
It's a nice little quaint Italian restaurant.
I know where it is, yeah.
Yeah. And Luke, you could tell he was, I mean, there was that anticipation because he really wasn't sure who would sign him. But, you know, you've obviously, through your contacts, and the GM out there is a St. Francis grad. So,
right.
But was San Diego always a team leaning toward?
They had been asking about, there were a couple of teams who were asking about Luke heavy all during the last season. And I got to be honest with you, I got asked about him when I was out doing games for CBS. They said, you know, tell me about him. And I knew about him as a kid. I didn't know that much about him as a player. I'd watch him on on Saturdays on a screen this big on a computer because I could never be there.
Right.
But I know kind of player he is, and I obviously know kind of human being he is, and I told him, and I spread it out. But I never really called anybody on his behalf and said, hey, listen, look at Mike. Never did any of that. I really never felt the need to do that. And the attention he got, he earned through a really good senior season and a nice pro day.
He's one of how many kids do you have?
5.
5 kids.
Yeah, he's the middle child.
Why come we're at dinners? I always say it's 9 or 10.
I don't know. They exaggerate. Yeah.
And of course, his son Tap, I'm a big fan of because he was a high school
wrestler. Yeah.
And okay, we were talking before we went on, and John DeSciullo, who works here, Mr. Television, who's not. If it came down between John and Irv Weinstein as to who knew less about sports, I'm not sure if there'd be a winner. But the one thing John knows about was the Super Bowl and the great job you did. The lights go out. Nobody's got a live microphone except Steve Tasker on the sidelines.
Well, actually, truth be told, we all had live mics. Well, Jim and Phil didn't, but I, myself, and Solomon Wilcots had live mics. But we couldn't hear the truck. We didn't have any IFB, which is internal feedback. So we were talking to the mics, and nobody was telling us they could hear us. Or they couldn't tell us they could hear us. So finally, my A2, my audio tech guy, which there's we have a crew of guys that helps us out on this. I make sure everything goes well. He goes, "You hear the truck, right?" And I go, "I don't hear anything." He goes, and he was then it gripped him what was going on, pulled his off and gave it to me. And then once I got his, I said, "Hey, Lance Barrow, who's the lead producer for CBS Sports, said, you got me." He goes, "Steve Tasker, can you hear me?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, Steve Tasker, you are taking it out of commercial. Tell them what happened. We're going to show them when the lights went out, and then and that's about it. We're going to break to another commercial pretty quick." I said, "Okay, Lance, I got it." And he goes back and he says, he gets them revved up, and he talks to the truck maybe for about 5 seconds. And he goes, "Steve Tasker, you're taking out a commercial in 5, 4, 3. And that was about all the notice I got, which was probably in hindsight a good thing. You don't want to think too much about it.
And you really had no idea what was going on.
No idea. And I didn't know what the fans were seeing at home. I didn't know what you were watching on television because I didn't have a monitor to see what you were seeing. We had 60 cameras to do the game. We were cut to 11 immediately and when the lights went out, and I didn't know that. I didn't know what you were looking at, and while I was speaking, and when I went back and listened to it, you could tell I was talking and tried to sound just like I'm sounding now, but Lance is in my ear saying, "Okay, now tell them about the lights going. We're showing them the lights going out, So I said, "Okay." As you can see, the game was proceeding as normal. I just kind of went with it.
Yeah,
it's live TV,
And unless you've experienced it, that's tough to do because you're talking, but you're not paying attention to what you're saying. You're listening, and then you're wondering what you just said.
It's live TV, and you know this, and for people at home, you'd love to do it again better. But it's live TV. You kind of gotta
and
go with
almost
live
more
with what you did.
importantly, You were then satirized on Saturday Night Live. They did a skit on it, which was hilarious.
Well, I didn't, obviously we don't get any notification of
Right.
that, and my phone started beeping and ringing because I have buddies, college buddies and friends, and they're like, "Hey, you're on Saturday Night Live." I'm like, "No, I'm at home. What are you talking about?" And so it came to light that you went back
it
and
was
looked
funny.
at it. It was great. It was great. And I tell you, the only two people who didn't think that was funny were my mom and dad.
Wow.
I thought it was
They weren't
great.
anybody poking fun of their son,
Yeah.
but you've made it when you're.
It was a big event. I mean, it was the most watched television and most interactive on the social media. It was the biggest, most attention-getting event of all time on electronic media, and the lights went out. So,
As a player, and you played at 4 Super Bowls, how do you think you would have reacted to that? Do the same thing that both teams just hang around?
it was a tough thing, and I don't think there's any question that. And I think we hit it pretty hard. Not only I mentioned it, but also the guys on the NFL Network, NFL Today on CBS. Bill Cowher, Shannon, Boomer, and Dan. They all said, "Man, this is going to change things," and it did. You don't shut it down, and particularly at that point, the Ravens had a 22-point lead. They just wanted that game to be over and be world champions, and they turned it off. And it was much like the 1993 wild card game in Buffalo, where the Oilers shut it off and the Bills allowed the Bills to keep playing and get back into it and win the game. That's what almost happened to the Ravens. Once you shut it down, it's hard to turn it back on. And the Niners, although they were relaxed during that delay, they still had that desperation. They still had that thing, we got to,
Right.
And the Ravens were like, 3 touchdowns? I like our chances, And that's all it takes in that game. And indeed, the Niners almost came back and put it away.
Okay, it's the offseason. We've gone through an NFL draft. Russ Brandon's the president of the Buffalo Bills. Doug Marone's the coach. Anticipation, again, high for the season. You've been around the team. I'm sure you've had a chance to talk to me. What's your sense?
Well, who knows how good a coach Doug Marone's going to be on the professional level. Certainly he was successful at Syracuse, but I know this. When you talk to him, and I talk to all the coaches all over the league, all the head coaches in production meetings, I sit just like we're sitting and we have conversation with them. I know Doug Marone's the right type of guy. He's the kind of guy that is going to put together with his personality the kind of staff and the kind of atmosphere that you need. He's that kind of guy. Now, how it's perceived and how that translates onto the field, we'll have to wait and see. But I know this, too, for Russ Brandon. I've known him for, 15, 17 years. He's smart, and it's really important to him, and he wants to do a good job. I mean, he wants it. And I think those are really important, really the only ingredients you need. A smart guy who it's important to, and he's going to get it done. I love the draft they just had. I was calling for E.J. Manuel. They don't tell me anything over there. I don't know who they're going to draft, and they never do, because they're the close. It's like SpongeBob and the Krabby Patty formula. It's a secret, So you don't know that? Okay.
No, I didn't know that.
So it's a super secret. So I don't know anything, but I did. I called for E.J. Manuel to be their first pick. He's the guy I wanted, and for the first time really ever, I got it right.
Well, and it's important that they don't let out, because obviously they don't want to tip off a team who's trying to get ahead of them.
I think it's really interesting because every team's the same. And some of the stories that came out before, particularly for the quarterbacks like Geno Smith, who was criticized in some circles before the draft. And I know a good friend of mine, Warren Moon, and they criticized the writer for coming down on Geno Smith for criticizing him some of the ways they did. They thought it was because he was a black quarterback and stuff. But in hindsight, after the draft, some of the teams corroborated what was said about him, and they seemed, and some of the things that have happened. He fired his agent. He seemed disconnected from the process. He seemed to feel like he was already going to be a top 5 pick, and he didn't have anything to worry about. And then when it didn't happen, he started pointing the finger at everybody except himself and the things that he did in the lead-up. It just didn't speak well for him. And so I think leading up to the draft, that's some of the most interesting stories that come out of it, how the players handle it. And what happens when it doesn't quite go the way they expect.
Did you watch the draft broadcast on ESPN?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
I think John Gruden's made Mel Kiper obsolete. I think Gruden he knows these players so much better than Kiper ever could.
Well, yeah, but I think the thing that Mel Kiper still does, and all those guys, still have going for them, there's so many players and so many schools. They know guys on other teams and they can evaluate them, and they watch film and look at these guys. The one thing they don't know is what happens in the room of those 32 teams and those 32 general managers and what they're thinking and how those things play out. That's what the one thing that Mel Kiper and even John Gruden and those guys will never know. So the draft, as much as you analyze it in the lead up, you never know what's going to happen until they start picking guys.
We'll take a break. More with Steve Tasker right after this. Welcome back to Sports Wrap-Up. My guest, Steve Tasker. And Steve, a couple weeks ago, I had the privilege, NFL Films was in town, and they interviewed, I think, a bunch of us, those of us old enough to remember some of the, not just the Bills of the 90s, but all the way back to O.J. Simpson. So I had a chance to sit down, and they had a couple lists, and I don't know if you're even aware of this, but they do shows, special shows on, like, great number 12s, and so they asked me about Jim Kelly. But they had, one of their categories was guys named Steve, and you made their list. So they asked me a bunch of questions about Steve Tasker. And but it's yet, you know, I just, having lived through the 90s with everybody, all the fans here in Buffalo, yeah, it'd been great to win a Super Bowl. But it's so gratifying to see how, you know, 20 years later, you and so many players on that team have really, you know, earned the respect of the fans, the league, the media.
I think you're right. I mean, and it's quite a deal going to 4 straight, because now they see all these teams. And I remember thinking this after we went, and we saw this, and the Cowboys almost did it too, and they almost won 4 straight. They won 3 out of 4. Right. And you think back, there were dozens of times when that could have derailed, and we wouldn't have gone to 4 straight. We would have gone to 1, then out of 1, and then back in for 1 and out. You know, there's just dozens or hundreds of moments that make the difference for a run like that to kind of stay intact. The comeback game is just one of them. So, and all the moments inside that game that could have derailed it. So, I think the thing that, for me, that I like about that group of guys, and you look back on it, we're more than willing to say we couldn't win it. I mean, we just couldn't get it done. I mean, I don't see any of our guys being bitter about it, because it's pretty cool to be a part of that team and go to 4 straight. And I said this even back then. I said if we'd won one of them, that first one or the second or third, we wouldn't have gone to 4 straight, because it was just, the screws were so tight that you know, it just kept perpetuating itself because of the losses. So, and I kind of like the fact that the guys are good with it. You know, I mean, it's, you know, I think we're at peace with never having won a Super Bowl, because there's so many guys just like us who never even got to one, let alone go to 4 straight. I think the fact that so many of us old guys like me and Daryl and Jim and you go down the list, we're okay with it.
Was every year, I mean, I think as a fan, even covering in the media, and you know, thinking back, they kind of blur together, but they were really unique teams. Each of those 4 teams were different teams.
Yeah, there was at least 10 to 12 guys new on every team. There were only 22 guys who went to all 4 Super Bowls. And I don't remember where I heard it, but there were 22 guys that were on for the Buffalo Bills who went to 4 Super Bowls. There were also 22 guys that went to all 4 Super Bowls for the Steelers. So it was kind of a number that kind of matched us with a team that really was great, as opposed to our team that was, you know, one of those just, you know, a team that did something really cool. But they were different. They were very different, and every one of those games was different. You know, they all had their own personality. And I think, you know, that's why people say, you know, when they talk about games and teams that are going to go and listen, it doesn't matter that whatever, you know, the Jacksonville Jaguars have never been to a Super Bowl. That team, last year's team and all those teams have nothing to do with this team that's going to take the field now. That's why when, you know, the pundits and me included, you go back and go, well, this team's never done this, and they've never had to. Listen, this is this team. That's why the 4th Super Bowl team is completely different than that first Super Bowl team, you know, and they're completely different, even though there've been that run in between.
Well, and that's also, I think, why it's so difficult to repeat. Because it's got to be the right combination every year.
Well, plus we were in that transition period between, once you signed with a club, they had your rights as long as you lived until they gave them up, and to this day and age now, and we kind of transitioned into the thing where there's Plan B, and then there was free agency, and we started losing guys.
Plan B. Yeah. Remember Plan B?
Yeah.
Will Wolford was one of the big first guys to leave the Bills. He went with the Colts. Plan B.
That's right.
Yeah, you're right. That's something that Bill Polian really didn't have to deal with until his last year.
Right. Yeah. That's correct. Yeah, and he went to Carolina and dealt with it there, and actually did a wonderful job there. Got that team to the championship game the next second season in existence, like the Jacksonville Jaguars did, and Bill was part of the. Bill was part of the league. He went to the league office for a year, helped set up the rules to be a brand new franchise, and then went and took advantage of those rules and got to the championship game. So
he didn't need the manual on that one.
he's the executive of the year for a reason.
All right, so what's new? Okay, your son's signed as a free agent. You got a great family. From a broadcasting standpoint, what's going to be new for Steve Tasker?
Well, I'm still doing some sideline work for Dial Global on some of the night primetime games. I'll work about 12 weekends for CBS. At least that's what it looks like at this point. It could change. They could change me anytime they wanted. And in the weekends that I'm not working for CBS, I'll go do a primetime game, a Thursday night, Sunday night, or Monday night game on the sidelines as a radio analyst for Dial Global's coverage. And then also every Wednesday night, our buddy Jim Kelly and I are going to be on Sirius XM radio doing a show called No Huddle, a 1-hour live call-in show where people can call in and talk to Jim or I call about it. And it's going to be about the Buffalo Bills franchise this day and age.
Right.
And obviously we'll reminisce if callers want to about things that happened, and Jim and I will share our experiences and how they pertain to the game.
You know what channel that is on Sirius?
NFL radio.
NFL radio?
Yeah, Channel 88.
And you're doing it right out of the stadium?
Right
where
at One Bills
Murph
Drive.
does his broadcast.
Jim's going to do 10 of the shows with me, and then I'm going to do another 10 with Andre, who will be in for Jim, because both those guys are busier than I am, I guess. So,
so I could call in. I could ask you a question.
You can call in. I don't have to take that call.
Is there delay?
Yeah.
You don't have to take that call.
I don't have to take that call.
Steve Tasker, and there's a funny story. The NFL film guy said, do you have any funny Steve Tasker stories that maybe we... Well, I says, actually, I told a story about when you wanted to come over to Channel 7 back in the 80s, and you wanted to be in broadcasting, and the famous story where I introduced you to Linda Pellegrino.
She didn't believe
she didn't believe it was you. You didn't look like a football player to her, and then we went out to the parking lot. You were leaving, and you wrote on the dirt on her window, "I really am Steve Tasker." Yeah, she was mortified. But that was 25 years ago.
25 years ago. That's a long time, and it goes by. I came to Buffalo overnight after being picked up off waivers, and that was working on 27 years.
Do you work out every day?
I never work out.
Really?
I don't exercise. I sometimes exercise, but I don't work out.
Well, you look great.
Well, you should feel it on the inside. It's not so great.
I think I look like you feel.
I feel good. I do feel good. I got and I had a whole list of injuries, but I do feel I've been very blessed. Been very, very blessed.
Well, buddy, I appreciate you coming out here.
Great to be
here. It's always great having you. It's great to reminisce, and I know I'm going to tune in to Sirius Radio. It'll be interesting to hear you two guys together on the air.
And before that, I'll probably be on. I'll be doing the Bills preseason games again. So with Ray, at this point, it looks like Ray.
Ray
but
Bentley.
I don't know if it'll be Ray or not. But I think it will be. So we'll see.
The Bills, I gave Russ Brandon credit as the business guy, the marketing guy, that they would always come up every year. He'd come up with something for fans to anticipate to sell tickets. This is like the biggest of all.
They do a great job over there. And let's face it, the football end of it hasn't held up its end of the bargain over the last 13 years or so. But they still do a lot of things right at One Bills Drive, even when they're not winning football games. I'm very proud of that organization for what it is. And I've been part of the marketing end of it for a long time now. But with Russ at the helm, I've been very proud of some of the things they've done off the field. And it's hard to sell hope when in hindsight, it looks like it was hopeless the whole time. But those people over there believe it 100% that team is headed in the right direction always, and they're all pulling the same direction. It's fun to see.
Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Tasker, always great to have him in studio. We'll be back to wrap things up right after this.